Three men were already down. The fourth outlaw stood frozen in the middle of Willow Creek's dusty main street. 30 seconds earlier, he had been terrorizing an entire town with a Winchester rifle. Now he couldn't even move. His eyes were fixed on the roof of the schoolhouse. Smoke drifted into the evening sky. Standing there with steady hands and an unwavering gaze was Emilia Whitmore, the school teacher, the woman who taught children how to read, the woman who carried books instead of weapons, the woman everyone assumed needed protecting. The outlaw slowly dropped his rifle. His voice trembled. Who are you?" Emilia never raised her voice. "I'm the person you should have left alone." But to understand how a quiet schoolteacher ended up defending an entire town, we have to go back 6 months. Willow Creek, a Montana territory, population 423. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Children played freely in the streets, ranchers woke before sunrise, families gathered at church every Sunday. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest. Then Emilia Whitmore arrived carrying 2 suitcases and a box full of books. She was 29 years old, unmarried, quiet, reserved. People immediately formed opinions. She won't survive her first winter. She's too delicate. She'll be back east before the year ends. Emilia simply smiled. She had heard those judgments her entire life. What nobody knew was that she carried a past that had quietly shaped her into someone extraordinary. Years earlier, her father had served as a Union Army marksman during the Civil War. When he returned home, he taught her one lesson she never forgot. People will underestimate you before they understand you. So learn skills no one can ever take away. At 12 years old, Emilia could hit a coin from 70 yards away. At 16, she could outshoot most grown men. But she never boasted. She never showed off. She learned that true strength rarely announces itself. And that became her greatest advantage. Everything changed when Jeremiah Kane arrived. Every frontier town eventually met someone like him. The kind of man who mistook fear for respect. Officially, he wasn't an outlaw. That was what made him dangerous. He owned cattle. He had money. He dressed well. But behind the scenes, he controlled thieves, intimidated ranchers, and forced struggling families to sell their land. He understood a simple truth. People don't surrender because they're weak. They surrender because they feel alone. Slowly, Willow Creek began to crumble. The blacksmith lost his business. A widow lost her ranch. A farmer disappeared after refusing to sell his property. Nobody spoke up. Everyone waited for someone else to act. Meanwhile, Emilia quietly observed everything. She noticed children arriving at school hungry. She heard mothers whispering their fears. She watched hope slowly disappear. And she recognized something history repeatedly teaches us. Bullies become powerful when good people remain silent. One afternoon, Jeremiah Kane walked into her classroom. The children immediately stopped talking. Kane leaned against her desk. "You should stay out of grown folks' business." Emilia calmly continued grading papers. Teaching children isn't a crime," he smirked. "No, but filling their heads with courage can become one." The room fell silent. Emilia finally looked up. "Then perhaps courage is exactly what this town needs." The children never forgot those words. Neither did Kane. Over the following weeks, things became worse. Barns were burned, livestock disappeared, threatening notes appeared on front doors. Willow Creek was being strangled by fear. Then tragedy struck. Samuel Harper, an elderly rancher, beloved by everyone, refused to surrender his land. The next morning, they found him beaten nearly to death. That was the breaking point. because fear always has a limit. Eventually, people either collapse under it or they fight back. That night, Emilia climbed into her attic. Inside an old wooden chest rested her father's Sharps rifle, untouched for years. She gently ran her hand across the barrel. Then she whispered, "It's time." For 2 weeks, she prepared. Before sunrise, after sunset, practicing in secret, every movement intentional, every shot precise. She wasn't preparing for revenge. She was preparing to protect. Then the inevitable happened. Jeremiah Kane rode into town with his men. This time they weren't making threats. They had come to take Willow Creek completely. Families ran indoors. Children cried. Shop owners locked their doors. The church bell rang wildly. Kane shouted across the street, "Anybody who stays loses everything." Then he fired into the air. Panic erupted, but Emilia had already prepared. She calmly escorted every child into the school basement, locked the doors, and climbed onto the roof. From there, she could see everything. Years of training took over. She wasn't angry. She wasn't scared. She was focused. The first shot shattered an outlaw's rifle. The second knocked another man's hat into the dirt. The third disabled a wagon wheel that blocked families from escaping. Then Kane realized something terrifying. This wasn't luck. Someone was controlling the entire battlefield. His men began to panic, because uncertainty is often more frightening than force itself. They couldn't clearly see her, only brief flashes. Then we arrive back at the moment where this story began. 3 men already down, the fourth outlaw surrendering, the entire town staring in disbelief, and Emilia standing on that rooftop. Kane pointed his gun toward her. She pointed hers back. And for several seconds, nobody moved. Then something extraordinary happened. The town finally woke up. The blacksmith stepped forward, then the ranchers, then the shopkeepers, then dozens more. For months they had lived divided. Now they stood together. Jeremiah Kane suddenly understood. His power was gone, because fear only survives when communities fall apart. His hand began to shake. Slowly he lowered his weapon. For the first time, fear had found him instead. Moments later, the townspeople surrounded Jeremiah Kane and took him into custody, ending his reign of terror once and for all. His men fled town without looking back, and Willow Creek never belonged to them again. Years later, children would tell stories about that day, but Emilia never accepted praise. The next morning, she returned to her classroom. She opened a book. She smiled at her students, and she continued teaching because she understood something many people still forget today. Heroes don't always look powerful. Sometimes they're quiet. Sometimes they're overlooked. Sometimes they're the person nobody notices, until the moment they decide to stand up. And perhaps that's why this story still resonates today, because every generation faces its own version of Jeremiah Kane, not always with guns, sometimes with intimidation, sometimes with greed, sometimes with fear itself. But history repeatedly proves one thing. Communities become strongest when ordinary people stop waiting for someone else to save them. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Frontier Legends Studio. Here, we tell stories that remind us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do what's right when fear surrounds everyone else. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room turns out to be the bravest one of all.